Okay. Krishna, Krishna, Krishna. Okay. Sharing my screen. Om Ajnanaatimirandasya Jnananjana Salakaya Chakshur Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Ena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Svapadantikam Namavam Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Nitinamine Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvisesha Sunyavadi Paschatya Satarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaura Bhaktarunda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Chapter 5, the war. Okay, let me start it off. Under the circumstances, since 1936 up to now, I was simply speculating whether I shall venture this difficult task, and that without any means and capacity. But as none have discouraged me, I have taken courage to take up the work. Srila Prabhupada, Back to Head, Godhead Magazine. This is the quote. So starting the chapter, the fire in the mud broke out almost immediately. A senior disciple said that there should be one Acharya who would be the spiritual successor to Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati and who would perform all initiations and settle all controversies. But Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati have never said that. He had never called for one Acharya. Rather, he had instructed the members of the Gaudiya Math to form a governing body of 12 men and carry on a concerted effort. But that instruction was abandoned, and the suggestion that there be one leader took hold. A single person instead of 12 should take charge, and now it became a rush for who? Two parties contested. Ananta Vasudeva, one of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's leading preachers, was ambitious, and he pressed his claim with a group of influential sannyasi supporters. Another man, Kunja Vihari, surely went after the properties. He had been a leading administrator under Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, and now he claimed ownership of the palatial temple in Calcutta as well as other properties and assets of the India-wide Gaudiya Math. Although in his will, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had expressed his desire that his disciples select a governing board to manage all properties and funds of the Gaudiya Math, Kunjavihari contested the will's legitimacy. He and his supporters argued that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had received the properties on behalf of God. He was not their rightful owner and therefore could not determine their future ownership. Thus, he and the others disputed over the legal and theological aspects of the former Acharya's position. Shortly after Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's passing away, litigation had begun. Ananta Vasudeva, supported by majority of the members. 1 second, man. Yeah.
I can continue. Shortly after Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's passing away, litigation had begun. Ananta Vasudeva, supported by a majority of the members of the Gaudiya Math, had claimed that he, as the next Acharya, was the owner and director of the property. But although Kunj Bihari had only a few supporters, he defied the majority by pressing his claim through lawyers in court. Kunj Bihari and his men had possession of the Chaitanya Math and the temples in Mayapur. Vasudeva's party captured other buildings. Quarreling and fist fights broke out. The preaching of the Gaudiya Math stopped. Abbay's inability to take part in the activities of the Gaudiya Math was suddenly in his favor. He had always been more a visitor than a member at Math, and at least externally more the Grihastha businessman than a missionary worker. This automatically put him at a distance from the fray. Of course, he was associated with the Matas in Bombay and Allahabad, but he had no managerial position, no claims to ownership, and no role in the litigation. Nor did he desire to take sides in the struggle for power. Like many of the other disciples, he was mortified to see that his spiritual master's instructions for cooperation had been disregarded and his mission thrown into a legal dispute. Abbay knew that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had wanted the leaders to work cooperatively, and so he could not sympathize with the varying factions. Both parties were an insult to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. But he wanted to preach. Although becoming a very good English preacher was something he was meditating on more than actively doing, the Gaudiya Math would logically have been the vehicle for his preaching. He had already contributed articles to the Gaudiya Math's publications and had been working with his godbrothers at the Allahabad and Bombay centers. Naturally, he thought of serving his spiritual master in terms of serving within his spiritual master's mission. But the Gaudiya Math, which had always been known for pure, bold preaching of the message of Lord Chaitanya, was now becoming known for embroiled factions. As the Gaudiya Math broke down, he was also affected. Under the present circumstances, how could he carry out his spiritual master's order to preach? Previously, the main obstacle to his preaching had been family commitments, but now the obstacles were compounded. Now he had to wait helplessly for the outcome of this struggle. What would Krishna bring about? 1938. His Bombay business diminishing. Abbay, now 42, moved back to Calcutta with his wife and family and rented a house at 6 Sita Kanta Banerjee Lane. The street was but a narrow lane lined on either side with 3-story houses. His office was on the first floor, facing the street, The family lived upstairs. He rented the adjoining building, number 7, and on the first floor operated a small chemical laboratory manufacturing distilled water. These pain liniment, Vimal tonic alpha, an injection for boils, and various other medicines. He also utilized a small outbuilding in the rear as part of his lab. Out front, he hung a large signboard, Abhay Charan and Sons, displaying a picture of a mustached Abhay Charan. Sometimes he would employ 2 or 3 servants to assist him, but mostly he worked alone, and he would deliver his glass jugs of distilled water to agents such as Bengal Company and Gluconet. He printed a brochure advertising these 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 pain liniment, good for relieving gout, rheumatism, and all pains. And if one wanted to be free of recurring diseases like rheumatism and gout, Abe's brochure directed that in addition to using these pain liniment, one refrained from alcohol and all sorts of drinking or intoxicating habits, and food and drink should be very simple and innocent, such as vegetables and milk. The new Calcutta business enjoyed an early success, but Abe did not have his heart in it. It was a duty. He had to do it to maintain his family. His new acquaintances in Calcutta found him to be a devotee of God at heart, a businessman, a family man, but more concerned with writing and preaching than with business and family. Chandi Mukherjee, a neighbor from nearby Bihari Street. He was interested only in devotional activities, and he did his business only to maintain the family. He did not seem interested in the profit motive, in accumulating money or becoming a rich man. Charan Mukherjee, Abe's next door neighbor. Abe Charan was always a very patient listener to every illogical argument that anybody, including myself, would bring to him. Not knowing philosophy, I would illogically present so many arguments, and Mr. Day would always very patiently listen. Nothing agitated him. He was always very calm, and he taught me about God. He would speak only of Krishna. He was translating the Gita and was maintaining his business. Yeah. Neighbors would often see him sitting on his coat in the front room. He would read his spiritual master's books and
Shall I
sometimes
continue,
recite the.
Mataji? Shall I
Yeah,
continue?
sure, Master.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Neighbors would often see him sitting on his cot in the front room. He would read his spiritual master's books and sometimes recite the Sanskrit slokas out loud. He liked to discuss philosophy with anyone who came by. His family keeping mostly upstairs. Abhay would sit alone in the downstairs front room, dressed in dhoti and kurta, or sometimes a dhoti and only a vest. Often he would be at his writing, while outside the door his children played with the children of the Ganguly family, who lived in the rare apartment of the same building. The neighbors lived openly in a kind of joint neighborhood family, and Abhay talked freely with the other neighbors, but of Vaishnava philosophy and only rarely of business. Mr. Ganguly found Abhay's speech scholastic and always very philosophical. Abhay was absorbed in the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, and even in brief conversations, he would refer to Lord Krishna and to Bhagavad-Gita's description of Lord Krishna as the basis of both the material and spiritual worlds. While working in his laboratory or receiving a delivery of empty bottles from the Muslim bottle merchant or going out to sell his medicine, he would be talking or thinking about God. In those days, for a person in Calcutta to be interested in God consciousness was not so unusual. Abai found even a man like Abdullah, the Muslim bottle merchant, to be very religious. One day, Abai asked Abdullah, who had once been very poor but had become rich by his business, "Now you have got money, so how are you going to use your money?" The bottle merchant replied, "My dear sir, I have an intention to construct a mosque." Meanwhile, the war of the Gaudiya Mutt raged on. Both factions were ill motivated and both deviated from the instructions of their spiritual master. The very act of trying to determine ownership of the properties through legal action meant that the God brothers were disobeying the express desire of their spiritual master, as stated in his will. The litigation continued year after year, but the legal wrangling could not bring them together or purify them. One court ruled in favor of Ananta Vasudeva, but then a higher court awarded two-thirds of the Mata's properties to Kunja Vihari and one-third to Vasudeva. Still, although Vasudeva had fewer properties, he inspired many more followers. He seemed to them more intent on reviving the preaching of the Gaudiya Mutt. But when Vasudeva subsequently fell down from the principles of sannyasa by going off with a woman, the groups broke further to pieces. Most of the sannyasis continued to maintain their principles, but many now left the jurisdiction of the two contending factions in disgust. Individuals formed their own ashramas, Gaudiya Mission, Chaitanya Gaudiya Mutt, and others. The unified entity of Gaudiya Mutt has an all India mission consisting of many temples, several presses, and hundreds of devotees working cooperatively under one leadership ceased to exist. God brothers continue to uphold the teachings of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as they had received them from Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati. But because they were meant to work together, they lacked their former united potency. Illusions of proprietorship and prestige had superseded the spiritual master's order, and Srila Bhakti Siddhanta's cause, a worldwide movement for propagating Lord Chaitanya's teachings, collapsed. Wherever Abhay went, he seemed to attract the company of his god brothers. Some followers of Sridhara Maharaja, the same Sridhara with whom he had worked in Bombay and whom he had always regarded as a good devotee and scholar, met Abhay at his place on Banerjee Lane and told this news to Sridhara Maharaja, and who was then living at his own ashrama in Mayapur. Sridhara Maharaja had disaffiliated himself from the factions of the Gaudiya Mutt, but as a sannyasi, he was still preaching and was interested in publishing Vaishnava literature. He had wanted to maintain an ashrama in Calcutta, so for 20 rupees a month, he rented from Abhay the 4 rooms on the second floor of number 7, above Abhay's chemical laboratory. Now, whenever they came to Calcutta, Sridhara Maharaja, Puri Maharaja, and Bhakti Saranga Maharaja based themselves here, staying in small separate rooms. It became a regular ashrama for sannyasis and brahmacharis. And Sridhara Maharaja put a sign out front, Devananda Saraswati Mutt. Sridhara Maharaja's establishment of a mutt in Mayapur with a branch in Calcutta was his response to the Gaudiya Mutt's split. Like other sannyasis, he had been initiating disciples and preaching, not waiting for the outcome of the litigation with its continued appeals and counterclaims. Abhay was glad to encourage Sridhara Maharaja and the others who joined him at his little ashrama. Here, Abhay and Sridhara Maharaja and his followers could remain aloof from the warring factions and together pursue their plans for spreading Krishna consciousness. The sannyasis cooked in their separate kitchen, performed their puja, and held morning and evening kirtanas and lectures. Abhay remained with his family, taking his own meals and performing his own puja, but he often went to discuss Srimad Bhagavatam with Sridhara Maharaja. From, from his roof, Abhay could see the towering steeple of his spiritual master's building, the Gaudiya Mutt of Bagh Bazar, its ownership now contested by bitter factions. Abhay would often accompany Sridhar Maharaja and his assistants at preaching programs where he would play the mridanga. And when Sridhar Maharaja fell ill, Abhay led the other devotees on preaching engagements, performing kirtana, playing mridanga, and giving lectures on the Bhagavatam. Sridhar Maharaja, we did not see Abhay as working very hard for making money, nor did he seem very rich or to have a lot of liquid funds. He was attracted more to the spiritual side of affairs than to his family affairs. He never discussed business prospects with me, whether the business was up or down, or whether he was planning to do this or that. Monetarily, he did not have sufficient funds for giving any to the mission. Abhay began to think seriously about writing Vaishnava literature. His spiritual master had seemed very pleased and had told the editor of the Harmonist, whatever he writes, publish it. Business profits, if he could somehow expand them, could go for printing books in English. As his spiritual master had said, if you ever get money, print books. Certainly, the Gaudiya Mutt was not going to do it. Kunja Vihari had sold Bhakti Siddhanta's printing presses to offset his legal expenses. No, Abhay would have to continue on his own, maintaining his business and simultaneously try to write and publish. And that was only the prescription of Srila Bhakti Siddhanta. It is better that he is living outside your company. When the time comes, he will do everything himself. It was in 1939 that Abhay wrote Introduction to Gita Upanishad. It was a short piece, but it signaled his intention to take on the task of one day translating Bhagavad-Gita into English with commentary. Of course, there were already many commentaries in English, but most of them had been written by impersonalists or others who had not been delivered the original spirit of the Gita, the spirit of Arjuna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. Hearing Bhagavad Gita directly from Lord Krishna, Abhay knew, however, that he could present Bhagavad Gita in the proper spirit by writing an English commentary based on the teachings of Lord Chaitanya and the disciplic succession. So he began. Whenever he could make time, he could write. Although a strict grammarian could find fault in his English composition, his meaning was always clear. In his introduction, Abhay reflected on the time when, as a young schoolboy, he had attended a lecture, Vidya Ratna, the jewel of education. The theme of the lecture had been that God does not exist and could not exist. If there were God, he would certainly have appeared on earth to put an end to all religious rivalry. But since God had not obliged man in this way, we should banish all thought of his existence from our minds. The audience, Abhay explained, consisting only of so many young boys, did not delve deeply into the subject matter of the lecture. Yet the majority, impressed by the arguments, carried away lofty ideas of godlessness and thus became agnostics at home. Abhay had not been satisfied with the agnostic conclusion because I had been trained by my father to be engaged in the worship of Sri Radha Govinda. But, but as a result of the Vidya Ratna lecture, I was experiencing some mental conflict between agnosticism and the existence of Godhead. Later, having heard from his spiritual master, Srila Bhakti Siddhanta, Abhay understood that the personality of Godhead exists in every sphere of activity, but we do not see the but we do not have the eyes to see him. Abhay wrote, even if the Lord personally manifests himself on earth, the quarreling mundaners will not stop their fighting and look upon Godhead or his representative due to ignorance. This is the birthright of the individual soul by the grace of God. Bhagavad-Gita is the true jewel of education. And in the Gita, Lord Krishna declares to the fighting people on earth, here I am, do not quarrel. The agnostic who had spoken of the jewel of education had been blinded by the jewel and therefore could not see and appreciate the personality of Godhead. Thus, he had gone on to convince others to become so called jewels also. Following his spiritual master, Abhay displayed an aggressive spirit for confronting all opponents of pure theism. In responding to his spiritual master's order to develop into an English preacher, Abhay was not simply making neutral scholarly presentations. He was willing and ready to fight, whether against modern agnostics or Vaishnavism's old traditional enemy, Mayavada impersonalism. Although few scholars taught the way of surrender to Lord Krishna, has espoused in Bhagavad Gita, almost all respected Bhagavad Gita as presenting the essence of all knowledge. The Gita, therefore, was the perfect vehicle for confronting those who misrepresented God and religion. The Gita was a challenge to the agnostics, apotheosists, anthropomorphists, impersonalists, henotheists, pantheists, and absolute monists. Although there were already more than 600 commentaries on Bhagavad Gita, they had been written by persons with an inner hatred for the personality of Godhead, and therefore they were imperfect. Such envious persons, Abhay wrote, have no entrance into the real meaning of Bhagavad Gita. In as such as a fly cannot enter into the covered jar of honey. Abhay described Indian culture as an almost impassable ocean due to its depth of thought and apparent mixtures of conclusions. But in this book, Abhay declared, I will establish that Krishna is the absolute personality of Godhead by referring to the available records of scriptures, which are the recorded history of Indian culture and thought. The sannyasis at 7 Banerjee Lane were impressed by the scope of Abhay's thought and intentions, as it was customary to award a title to an especially worthy Vaishnava according to his qualities. Bhakti Saranga Swami Goswami wanted to confer upon Abhay the title Bhakti Siddhanta Sridhara Maharaja. However, thought it inappropriate to give Abhay the same title as their spiritual master, and he asked that Abhay's title he changed to Bhakti Vedanta. Bhakti means devotion and Vedanta meaning the end of knowledge. Abhay was grateful. The title combined the devotion of religion with the scholarship of the most rigorous philosophy, has passed down by the scholarly followers of Lord Chaitanya. He appreciated the sincere gesture of his god brothers and accepted the title as a further commitment to his spiritual path of preaching Krishna consciousness. Abhay continued regularly associating with Sridhara Maharaja and discussing with him Srimad Bhagavatam. Abhay encouraged him to preach widely. Although Sridhara Maharaja was admittedly more the scholar and rather shy about going out and preaching, on several occasions, Abhay tried to convince Sridhara Maharaja to go with him and charge Gandhi and Nehru as to why they were not following the principles of Bhagavad-Gita. Another fruit of the spiritual association at 7 Banerjee Lane was a book called Prapanna Jivan Amrita, compiled by Sridhara Maharaja, a collection of verses from various Vaishnava scriptures, including excerpts from the works of Sri Rupa Goswami. It was divided into 6 chapters according to the 6 divisions of surrender. Abhay, along with the sannyasis of the Devananda Saraswati Mutt, financed the publication. Thus, it was published as a joint effort by friends. September 3rd, 1939, Lord Linlithgow, Viceroy of India, announced that India was at war with Germany. Thus, England swept India into the war without consulting any Indians. Although independence minded India certainly resented such a show of foreign control, there were mixed feelings about the war. India wanted independence, yet she sympathized with the Allied cause against fascism in the West and feared an invasion by Imperial Japan in the East. Since you dislike the British so violently, one author asked a typical New Delhi student of the day, would you want Japan to invade and conquer India? Student, no. But we Indians pray that God may give the British enough strength to stand up under the blows they deserve. Although at the outbreak of the war, India had only 175,000 men in her armed forces. The British managed to increase the number of Indian soldiers to 2 million. There was no draft, but the British sent recruiting agents all over India, especially in the Punjab, where military service seemed an attractive offer to the local poor. The Punjabis proved good fighters, whereas Bengalis enlisted as officers, doctors, contractors, and clerks. Indian soldiers were dispatched to battlefields in Egypt, Iraq, Syria, Persia, Malaya, Burma, and Assam. While the British were attempting to mobilize Indians for the war, the Indian national movement, which had continued off and on for more than 20 years, became very active. Members of the Congress party refused to cooperate with the war effort and demanded guaranteed independence for India. Some thought that since England had her hands full with Germany, the time was ripe to revolt and gain independence by force. Gandhi's position had been one of unconditional pacifism, and he had opposed the idea of Indians taking up arms, even to defend India. But by 1942, he had become more inimical and had reduced his policy towards the British to a simple, unequivocal quit India. Thousands of Indians responded by chanting slogans in the street and even by tearing up the railway lines. Abhai's militant former schoolmate Subhash Chandra Bose fought against the British in his own way. He had approached Hitler in Germany and gotten him to agree that when the Germans captured Indian soldiers, Germany would return them to Bose, who would
mm,
maintain them in his nationalist army. With this army, Bose planned to return to India and drive the British from Indian soil. But dissatisfied with his progress in Germany, Bose made a similar agreement with Tojo in Japan, and soon thousands of Gurkhas and Sikhs, the best fighters in the Indian army, had defeated from the British army to join Bose freedoms fighters in Singapore. Bose began to prepare his army to invade India from the north. Then in 1943, the British found that the Japanese who had already taken Burma were at the doors of India, approaching Bengal by their tactic known as the denial policy. The British sank many Indian boats carrying food and destroyed large rice crops, fearing that they would fall into the hands of the enemy. This left local Indians starving and without the boats they needed for trade. The famine that ensued was the worst that had hit Bengal in 150 years. The government removed all control of food costs, and those who could not afford to buy at the skyrocketing prices died in the streets of Calcutta.
mm,
Srila Prabhupada, I have got experience. The government created artificial famine. The war was going on. So, Mr. Churchill's policy was to keep the people in scarcity so they will volunteer to become soldiers. So, this policy was executed. Big men, they collected the rice. Rice was selling of 6 rupees per mound. All of a sudden, it came to 50 rupees per mound. I was in the grocery shop purchasing, and all of a sudden, the grocer said, "No, no, I am not going to sell anymore." At that moment, the price was 6 rupees per mound. So suddenly, he was not going to sell. A few hours later, I went back to purchase, and the rice had gone up to 50 rupees per mound. The
mm.
government,
Paying almost 10 times.
yeah, 10 times. The government appointed agents began to purchase the rice and other commodities which are daily necessities. They can offer any price because the currency is in their hands. They can print so called papers, $100 and pay. A man becomes satisfied thinking, "Oh, I have $100, but it is a piece of paper." That was the policy. You have no money, no rice. So another avenue is open. Yes, you have become a soldier. You get so much money. People out of poverty would go there. I have seen it. No rice was available in the market and people were hungry. They were dying. Abhay managed to purchase just enough for his own family to survive, but he saw the beggar population increase by the hundreds. Month
Mm,
after month, he saw the footpaths and open spaces congested with beggars cooking their food on improvised stoves and sleeping in the open or beneath the trees. He was starving children, rummaging in the dustbins for a morsel of food. From there, it was but a step to fighting with the dogs for a share of the garbage. And this also became a familiar sight in the Calcutta streets. The British had little time to spare from their war efforts, and they worked only to save those
Nice.
lives essential for the fight. For the common people, the empire's prescription was uniform and simple: starvation.
Mm,
Srila Prabhupada, one American gentleman, was present at that time. He remarked, "People are starving in this way. In our country, there would have been revolution. Yes, but the people of India are so trained. that in spite of artificial famine, they did not commit theft, stealing others' property. People were dying. Still, they thought, all right, God has given. This was the basic principle of Vedic civilization. Abhay knew that under the laws of nature, there was no scarcity. But God's arrangement, the earth could produce enough food. The trouble was man's greed. There is no scarcity in the world. Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati had said, the only scarcity is of Krishna consciousness. And this was how Abhay saw the 1943 famine. Now more than ever, this spiritual vision was relevant. Krishna consciousness was the prime necessity. How else could man be checked from his evil propensities to become greed, hoard, make war, and thus create misery for millions? He had seen the heinous activities of the British in India, their cutting off the thumbs of the weavers so that Indian made cotton goods could not compete with the foreign made cloth, their shooting down of unarmed innocent citizens, they creating artificial famine, they're propagating the myth that Indian civilization was primitive. Still, he did not believe that an independent Indian government would necessarily be an improvement. Unless the leadership was Krishna consciousness, and neither Gandhi nor Subhash Chandra Bose was, then the government would be able to provide no real solutions, only stop gap measures. Without obedience to the laws of God, as expressed by the scriptures and sages, governments would only increase human suffering. Then Calcutta was bombed day after day. The bombing was concentrated in specific areas such as the Kittapur port facility and Shama Bazar in North Calcutta, very near Abhai's home at Sita Kanta Banerjee Lane. American planes had been leaving from airfields near Calcutta for targets in China and Japan. So the air raids on Calcutta seemed an inevitable retaliation. It was the Japanese striking back, or was it? Some said it was the forces of Subhash Chandra Bose, since the bombs fell mostly in the European quarter. But for the people of Calcutta, it made little difference who was attacking. After the first bombing, people evacuated the city. Blackouts were imposed, and at night, the entire city was dark. Srila Prabhupada.
You want to say something now?
Yes, Prabhuji.
The devotees can take on.
Prabhuji, the main thing, like after Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur left, like they were like so much fighting in his disciples, like two parties. One is like Vasudeva and the other is Kunja Vihari. And something has happened. And the main takeover points, Prabhuji, like Srila Prabhupada would be discussed with, he used to discuss Srimad Bhagavatam with what's the name of the person?
Sridhar Maharaj.
Sridhar Maharaj. The main thing. See, Sridhar Maharaj used to stay upstairs in the same building. He used to stay at his home. But the only thing he used to discuss is Srimad Bhagavatam. Nicely. And from the beginning, Prabhupada is only interested in Krishna consciousness, reading books and preaching. That's it. Bhagavatam. Only reading Bhagavatam. And he wrote the book like Introduction to Gita Upanishad. Only Bhagavatam, Bhagavad-Gita, and his spiritual master's books. Main thing.
Okay. Maharaj was the one who established the center. The discussions was with Bhakti Saranga Maharaj. any case. Anyone want to read? Okay, I will read. Where is it? Srila Prabhupada. The whole Calcutta became vacant. Perhaps only myself and few others remained. I sent my son to Navadvipa. Of course, my daughter was married. My wife refused to go out of Calcutta. She said, I'll be bombed, but I will not go. So I had to remain in Calcutta. I have seen bombing in Calcutta all night. I was just eating when there was the siren. So the arrangement was that in your house would be the shelter room. I was hungry, so I first finished eating. Then I went to the room and the bombing began. Chi, cam. I was thinking that this was also Krishna in another form, but that was not a very lovable. In the midst of these calamities, Abhay felt more than ever the need to propagate Krishna consciousness. He had something to say to the war-weary citizens of the world, and he longed for a more effective forum, a publication of some kind, a way to present the world's crisis through the eyes of scripture in the same bold style as had his spiritual master. There was no shortage of ideas, and he had been saving money from his business for this very purpose. Yet, how could he dare produce such a journal when even learned sannyasis, senior disciples of Srila Bhakti Siddhanta, were not? So he never considered himself a great scholar among his god brothers, although they call him Kavi and now Bhakti Vedanta. As a Grahastha, he wasn't expected to take the lead or publish his own journal. But times had changed. The English journal, The Harmonist, had not been published since before Srila Bhakti Siddhanta's passing away. Now, almost a decade had passed, and the Gaudiya Math had been too busy fighting in court to consider preaching. The Gaudiya Math had been too busy fighting in court to consider preaching. Long gone was the tireless spirit that for 10 consecutive years had produced the daily Nadia Prakasa. No longer were four separately located printing presses pumping out transcendental literature under the direction of Bhaktivinoda Thakura's empowered son. The press has been sold by Kunjavihari. Times had changed. Gaudiya Math was only fighting, while the non-devotees were killing each other in a world war. So from his front room at 6 Sita Kanta Banerjee, Abhay conceived, wrote, edited, and typed the manuscript for a magazine. He designed a logo, a long rectangle across the top of the page. In the upper left-hand corner was a figure of Lord Chaitanya, effulgent with rays of light like rays from the sun. In the lower right were silhouettes of crowd of people in darkness but groping to receive light from Lord Chaitanya. And between Lord Chaitanya and the people, the title unfurled like a banner back to Godhead. In the lower right corner was a picture of Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati seated at his writing, looking up thoughtfully as he composed. Above the logo ran the motto, Godhead is light, nescience is darkness. Where there is Godhead, there is no nescience. Below the logo were the following lines. Edited and founded under the direct order of his divine grace, Srimad Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami Prabhupada by Mr. Abhay Charan Dev. Abhay had already gained some printing experience in connection with his business. And after completing a manuscript, he brought it to Saraswati Press, the best printers in Bengal. He also hired an agent, Calcutta's prestigious booksellers, Thakur, Spink and Company, who would take responsibility for distributing the journal to bookstores and libraries, including outlets in several foreign countries. But when he went to buy paper, he met with government restrictions. Because of the war, and the subsequent paper shortage, they wanted to essay what he had written in terms of the national needs. During this time of world crisis, an ordinary citizen's religious newspaper was hardly top priority. So Abhay's request for paper was perfunctorily denied, but he persisted. He appealed that using paper to print the teachings of the personality Godhead was not a waste and not untimely in the present troubled atmosphere. Finally, he obtained permission to print his first edition of Back to Godhead, a 40-page publication. 40-page publication for short. Abhay greeted his readers by defining his motto: Godhead is light, nations is darkness. When man forgets that he is the son of Godhead and identifies himself with the body, then he is in ignorance. He's like a man who is very concerned with the automobile's mechanism, yet with no knowledge of the driver. Such a opening paragraph, no? So straight and so bold. The defect of the present day civilization is just like that. This is actually the civilization of nations or illusion. And therefore, civilization had been turned into militarization. Everyone is fully concerned with the comforts of the body and everything related with the body, and no one is concerned with the spirit that moves the body. Although even a boy can realize that the motor car mechanism has little value if there is no driver of the car. This dangerous ignorance of humanity is a gross nescience and has created a dangerous civilization in the form of militarization. This militarization, which in soft language is nationalization, is an extreme barrier to understanding human relations. There is no meaning in a fight where the parties do fight only for the matter of different colored dresses. There must be, therefore, an understanding of human relation without any consideration of the bodily designation or colored dresses. So Back to Godhead is a feeble attempt by the undersigned under the direction of His Divine Grace, Srimad Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Prabhupada, the celebrated founder and organizer of the Gaudiya Math activities, just to bring up a real relation of humanity with central relation of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That there is a great and urgent need of literature like this is keenly felt by the leaders of all countries. And the following statements will help much in the procedure. It was in 1944, Abhay specifically addressed the crisis of World War. The world's political leaders were expressing their disgust at their people's suffering and scarcity. After 4 years of fighting, costing millions of human lives, the Second World War within 20 years was still scourging the earth. Although the end was in sight, the leaders expressed not so much happiness and hope as weariness and uncertainty. Even if this war ended, would there be yet another war? Had man not yet grasped the vital lessons of how to live in peace? So Abhay quoted the Archbishop of India. India, guided by God, can lead the world back to sanity. He quoted the President of the United States. A program, therefore, of moral rearmament for the world cannot fail to lessen the dangers of armed conflict. Such moral rearmament, to be most highly effective, must receive support on a worldwide basis. So he mentioned former President Herbert Hoover, who had affirmed that the world needs to return to moral and spiritual ideals. And he quoted a resolution by the British House of Commons, affirming that spiritual principles are the common heritage of all people, and that men and nations urgently need to acknowledge the sovereignty of God. He quoted Wendell Willkie, who, after his return from Russia, had reported millions of Russians killed, wounded, or missing in the war, and the millions more suffering from the winter of terrible scarcity and subjugation. So, what is true for Russian people, Abhay wrote, is also true for other people. And we Indians are feeling the same scarcity, the same want, the same disgust. He quoted Britain's Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, who had been filled with lamentation and indignation at the miseries of war. He quoted Archbishop of Canterbury. In every quarter of earth, men long to be delivered from the curse of war and to find in a world which has regained its peace respite from the harshness and bitterness of the world they have known till now. But so often they want the kingdom of heaven without its king. It's the kingdom of God without God, and they cannot have it. It is nice how Prabhupada is so present with uh, the current affairs in the world, and even he was quoting so confidently and eloquently their comments and their quotes. Okay, our resolve must be back to Godhead. We make plans for the future for peace amongst the nation and for civil security at home. That is quite right enough, and it would be wrong to neglect it. But all our plans will come to shipwreck on the rock of human selfishness unless we turn to God. So back to Godhead, that is a chief need of every chief need of England and of every nation. He also quoted Sir Francis, young husband of Britain. Now that religion is everywhere attacked brutally, we look to India, the very home of religion, for a sign. And finally he quoted Sir Sarvepalli Radhakrishna. He says, this war, when it would be won, would prove to be the breeding ground of other wars if the peace was not saved. So it could happen only if powerful nations ceased to take pride and glory in their positions, which were based on labor and tribute of other weak nations. This perhaps was that Sir Harcourt Butler meant when he said that principle in the Hinduism, when he said that the principles of Hinduism contain essential elements of saving the world of civilizations. And in another quote, Dr. Radhakrishnan, Abhay offered a statement he also used as one of the mottos of the magazine. So we have to defeat tyranny in the realm of thought and create a will for world peace. Instruments for training the mind, educating human nature should be used to develop a proper social outlook, without which institutional machinery was of little use. Abhay expresses confidence that the spiritual resource of India could be used by everyone, not only to enhance the glory of India, but to benefit the world. So next, he told how he had come to begin to back to Godhead magazine, how he had written a letter 2 weeks before the disappearance of Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati, and how his spiritual master had instructed him to preach in English. Under the circumstances, since 1936 up to now, I was simply speculating whether I shall venture this difficult task, and that without any man and capacity, without means and capacity, but as none have discouraged me, I have now taken courage to take up the work. But at the present moment, my conscience is dictating me to take up the work, although the difficulties are not over for the present situation arising out of war conditions. Abhay stated that his paper would contain only the transcendental messages of the great sages of India, especially Lord Chaitanya, and that his duty would be simply to repeat them, just like a translator. He would not manufacture anything, and so his words would descend as a transcendental sound for guiding people back to Godhead. He admitted that the subject matters of back to Godhead, beginning from total different sphere of consciousness, might seem dry to his readers, but he held that anyone who will actually give who actually gave attention to the world would benefit. Sugar candy is never sweet to those who are suffering from the disease of bile, but still sugar candy is the medicine for bilious patient. The taste of sugar candy will gradually be revived if the bilious patient goes on taking sugar candy regularly for the cure of disease. We recommend the same process to the readers of Back to Godhead. So, I mean, it is so scary. The chapter war. I was thinking initially it must be the war that is happening in the world, but the chapter actually started with the war from the Bengal, and war from the Math, the Gaudiya Math, and then the combined war with the World War. So these are all going, and Prabhupada is moving, persisting, especially like when he was trying to print his magazine, they didn't allow him to print, but still he persisted and Krishna made it happen. So anyone want to read from here?
I can read Prabhupada. That would be a little disturbance from Arya. I'll try. Abhay focused on presenting the timeless message of the Vedas, but in the context of current crisis. In his essay, Godhead and His Potentialities, he presented Vedic evidence and logical arguments to explain the transcendental nature of Godhead and the individual souls, both being deathless, blissful, and full of knowledge. Because men have forgotten and neglected their vital connection with God, they can never be satisfied in the material world, which is temporary and beset with unavoidable miseries. As spirit souls, everyone is eternal by nature, and therefore everyone tries to avoid the onslaught of distresses and dangers which come one after another. But the material body is meant for suffering and ultimately for destruction. The exodus of the residents of Calcutta to other places out of fear. Arya. Fear of being raided by the Japanese bombs is due to the same tendency of non-destructible existence. But those who are thus going away do not remember that even after going away from Calcutta, saved from the raids of Japanese bombs, they are unable to protect their bodies as non-destructible in any part of the material universe, when the same bodies will be raided by the bombs of material nature in the form of threefold miseries. The Japanese also, who are threatening the Calcutta people with ruthless air raids for increasing their own happiness by possession of lands, do not know that their happiness is also temporary and destructible, as they have repeatedly experienced in their own fatherland. The living beings, on the other hand, who are designed to be killed, are by nature eternal, impenetrable, invisible, etc. So all those living entities who are threatened to be killed, as well as those who are threatening to conquer, are all alike in the grip of the Maya potency and are therefore in the darkness. Abhay wrote that never by their own devices could men escape the conditions of destruction. So many world leaders were seeking relief from the war, but all were useless because their attempts for peace were within the material conception of life. Their attempts were like attempts to elevate darkness with darkness, but darkness can be removed only by light. Without light, any amount of speculation of the human mind, which is also a creation of the material nature, can never restore the living entities to permanent happiness. In that darkness, any method of bringing peace in the world can bring only temporary relief or distress, as we can see from all creations of the external potency. In the darkness, non-violence is as much useless as violence, while in the light, there is no need of violence or non-violence. Abe did not deal exclusively with the war. In Theosophy and in Vaishnavism, he criticized the shortcomings of the fashionable ideas of Theosophy, which the followers of Madame Blavatsky had popularized in India. In congregational chanting, he upheld the scriptural prediction that the Sankirtana movement of Lord Chaitanya would spread to every town and village on the surface of the earth. From this foretelling, we can hope that the cult of Sankirtan will take very shortly a universal form of religious movement, and this universal religion, wherein there is no harm in chanting the name of the Lord, nor is there any question of quarrel, will continue for years, as we can know from the pages of authoritative scriptures. The central theme of Back to Godhead was clearly the order of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. In its cover with its picture of a thoughtful Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, in his dedication, in its statement of the magazine's purpose, in its handling of issues, its analysis of theosophy, his predictions of the spread of Sankirtana, in its every aspect, the theme of Back to Godhead was the order of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. There was also 4 shorter essays by other contributors, including Bhaktisaranga Goswami. An advertisement on the back cover highlighted Gita-Upanishad by Abhay Cherande, editor and founder, Back to Godhead, in 3 parts, 1200 pages, royal size, first-class Morocco binding. An elaborate exposition of the world-famous Hindu philosophy, the Bhagavad-Gita, in its true scientific theistic interpretations by the chain of disciplic succession from Sri Krishna, Brahma, Narada, Vyasa, Madhva, Mavendra Puri, Ishvara, Lord Chaitanya, Rupa Goswami, Jiva Goswami, Krishnadas, Narottama, Vishwanath, Valdeva, Jagannath, Thakur Bhakti Vinod, Gaur Kishore, Thakur Siddhanta Saraswati, down to the author with numerous illustrations in colors and plain from many authentic scriptures. To be published shortly, customers booked in advance price, India rupees 18, foreign 1. As a second major work, Lord Chaitanya in 2 parts, totaling 1000 pages. Neither of these manuscripts was actually near completion, but Abhay was expressing his eagerness to undertake such large works on behalf of his spiritual master. In attempting to print the second issue of Back to Godhead, Abhay encountered the same difficulty as before. Twice he requested permission to purchase newsprint, and twice the government denied his request. The paper was restricted on account of the war. On July 10, 1944, Abhay wrote a third letter. With due respect, I beg to submit that under the instruction of His Divine Grace Srimad Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Maharaj, the spiritual head of the Gaudiya Vaishnavas, I had to start a paper under the caption Back to Godhead. The very name will suggest the intention of starting such a paper in the midst of heavy turmoil through which the world is now passing. A copy of the same booklet is sent here for your kind perusal. In that booklet, you shall find strong world opinions, even by many reputed politicians all over the world, in favor of such a movement to bring back the world into sanity by training the mind and educating human nature for the unshaking spiritual plane, considered to be the supreme need of humankind. I hope you will kindly go through the paper by making some time, and I may draw your attention especially to the introductory portion. Abhay also remarked that the editorial board of Back to Godhead felt that there was not so much a scarcity of paper as a scarcity of education. Taking the opportunity to preach, Abhay explained that although the ultimate supplier was the personality of Godhead, godless men considered themselves the proprietors of all things. Catastrophe that is now in vogue in the present war of supremacy is guided by this false sense of proprietorship. And therefore, there is need of making propaganda amongst all human beings in order to bring them back to the sense of the ultimate proprietorship of Godhead. Abhay considered that there might indeed be a paper shortage in India. But in ancient times, he wrote, enlightened Indians had regularly sacrificed tons of valuable ghee and grains in the fire during the religious sacrifices. And in those times, there had not been any scarcity. People now, however, having abandoned all sacrifices to the Supreme Lord, were producing only scarcity. Prabhu, I'll stop here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You want me to summarize, Prabhu, or can someone take over?
What you read.
Yeah. So Prabhupada, he is trying his best to release the, enlighten the magazine, the Back to Godhead magazine, and he was trying to ask the government to provide the papers. So he was writing the letters back to the government for providing the papers, and he was also explaining that there is too much of scarcity and there is no guard in this current situation. But if we educate people with this godly, saintly nature, or then we will get the peace and everything. So Prabhupada, he's trying for all these nice things.
I can read, Prabhu.
Yeah.
Can we not therefore sacrifice a few reams of paper in the midst of many wastages for the same purpose in order to derive greater benefit for the humankind? I request that the government should take up this particular case in the light of spiritualism, which is not within the material calculation. Even if Great Britain, the government, has immensely supported a similar movement called the moral rearmament movement, without consideration of the scarcity of paper, which is more acute there than here. Let there be a page, only if not more, for the publication of Back to Godhead. Only if not more, for the publication of Back to Godhead, for which we do not mind, but my earnest request is that the government should at least let there be a ventilation of the atmosphere, for which my paper Back to Godhead is meant. Kindly therefore give it a serious consideration and allow me to start even by one page every weekly or monthly as you think best, without thinking it as ordinary waste of paper, for the sake of humanity and Godhead. The letter was successful. Now, with veiled sarcasm, he headlined his second issue, thanks to the government of India. He informed his readers, many of whom had been disappointed to learn that the government had curtailed his printing, that he would be able to continue his magazine every month. Abhay printed his letter to the government paper officer and also the reply granting him permission. His articles were shorter this time, displaying the flair of a new news columnist, as with philosophical criticism, verve, and a touch of ironic humor. He commented on world leaders and crises, Gandhi Jinnah talks, Mr. Churchill's humane world, Mr. Bernard Shaw's wishful desire, and spontaneous love of Godhead. comprised the issue. Gandhi Jinnah talks. We are sorry to learn that Gandhi Jinnah talks about unity of the Indian people have failed for the present. Abhay was not very optimistic about the results of such occasional talks between several heads of communities. Even if they made a successful solution, it would break up and take the shape of another problem. They were looking for unity between Muslims and Hindus, but in Europe, the fighting parties were Christians, and in Asia, they were mostly Buddhists, but still they were fighting. So fighting will go on between Hindu and Mohammedan, between Hindus and Hindus, or between Mohammedan and Mohammedan, between Christians and Christians, and between Buddhists and Buddhists till the day of annihilation. As long as there was the contaminated self-interest of sense gratification, there would be fighting between brother and brother, father and son, and nation and nation. Real unity would stand only on the plane of transcendental service to the Supreme. Mahatma Gandhi, Abhay wrote, is far above ordinary human being, and we have all respects for him. But Abhay advised Gandhi to give up his activities on the material plane and rise to the transcendental plane of the spirit. Then there could be talks about the unity of all people. Abhay cited Bhagavad-Gita's definition of a Mahatma, one who concentrates his attention on the service of the Supreme Lord, Sri Krishna. He requested Mahatma Gandhi to adhere to the teachings of Bhagavad-Gita and preach its message of surrender to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Sri Krishna. In such way, Mahatma Gandhi, through his influential position in the world, could bring about universal relief simply by preaching the message of Bhagavad-Gita. Mr. Churchill's Humane World. We are pleased to find that leaders of world politics, such as Mr. Churchill, have nowadays begun to think of a humane world and trying to get rid of the terrible national frenzy of hate. The frenzy of hate is another side of the frenzy of love. The frenzy of love of Hitler's own countrymen has produced the concomitant frenzy of hatred for others. And the present war is a result of such dual side of a frenzy called love and hatred. So when we wish to get rid of the frenzy of hate, we must be prepared to get rid of the frenzy of so-called love. This position of equilibrium free from love and hatred is attained only when men are sufficiently educated. Wow. Until men were educated to see the soul within the body, the dual frenzy of love and hate would continue and a humane world would not be possible. This introspection, Abhay concluded, is easily attained by the service of Godhead. So Mr. Churchill's humane world implies that we must go back to Godhead. Mr. Bernard Shaw's wishful desire. Mr. Bernard Shaw had congratulated Mahatma Gandhi on the occasion of the latter's 76th birthday in the following words. I can only wish this were Mr. Gandhi's 35th birthday instead of his 76th. We heartily join with Mr. Shaw in his attempt to subtract 41 years from the present age of Mahatma Gandhi. But death does not respect our wishful desire. Neither Mr. Shaw nor Mahatma Gandhi nor any other personality had ever been able to solve the problem of death. The leaders of nations have opened many factories for manufacturing weapons for the art of killing, but none has opened a factory to manufacture weapons for the protection of, for protecting man from the cruel hands of death. Although our wishful desire is always not to die. Men were preoccupied with the problem of how to get bread, although this problem was actually solved by nature. Man should try to solve the problem of death. Bhagavad-Gita tells that the problem of death can be solved, although death is everywhere in the material world. One who attains to me, says Krishna, never has to take his birth again in the material world. There is a spiritual world, non-destructible, and one who goes there does not come back to the region of death. Why should the leaders of nations cling to the planet of their birth, where death is inevitable? Abhay concluded, we wish that in their ripe old age, Mr. Shaw and Mahatma Gandhi will make combined effort to educate men to learn how to go back to home, back to Godhead. After 2 issues of Back to Godhead, Abhay had to stop. Printing was costly, but he kept writing regularly, working at Gitopanishad, turning out new articles and philosophical purports on the scriptures, even in the same book in which he wrote his pharmaceutical formulas. One night, Abhay had an unusual dream. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta appeared before him, beckoning. He was asking Abhay to leave home and take sannyas. Abhay awoke in an intensely emotional state. How horrible, he thought. He knew it was not an ordinary dream. Yet the request seemed so difficult and unlikely. Take sannyas? At least it was not something he could do immediately. Now he had to improve the business, and with the profits he would print books. He went on with his duties, but remained shaken by the dream. In 1945, the war over and India still in turmoil under British rule, Abhay saw a good opportunity to make his business more successful. In Lucknow, 600 miles from Calcutta, he rented a building and opened his own factory, Abhay Charan De and Sons. It was a major investment, requiring 40,000 rupees to start, and he began on a larger scale than ever before. Also, according to law, to ensure that he was not dealing in the black market or misusing chemicals, he had to employ 3 government inspectors. Yet, despite a high overhead, he established a good market, and his products were in demand. He closed his small operation in Calcutta and concentrated on his Lucknow business. Although the building was known locally to be haunted by ghosts, Abhay had not been deterred. But when he began his operations, some of his workers came to him frightened. Babu, there is a ghost. Abhay then went through the entire building chanting Hare Krishna, and after that there were no more complaints of ghosts. On November 13, Abhay wrote to his servant Gauranga mentioning some of his difficulties in Lucknow and asking him to come there to help. In his letter, Abhay spoke bitterly of his wife, Radharani, and children. Gauranga Prabhu, please accept my obeisances. I received your letter dated 7th. Due to lack of time, I could not reply in time. I stay here alone with some servants. If I leave now, then I have to close everything down. Due to my leaving once and closing the business, I have lost about 10,000 rupees. And the goodwill has also been affected, and my enemies have increased. That is why I am fighting, practically staking my whole life. I'm staying here all alone in the middle of so many difficulties, not for nothing. That's why I was writing to you repeatedly to come here. As soon as you receive this letter, show it to Dubra. Take at least 10 rupees from him and come here. When you come here, I will make arrangements to send money to your home. What's the point in holding you back with an excuse that there is no servant or maidservant? I tried to serve them enough for keeping servants, maidservants, and cooks. But up until today, they have not become attached to devotional service. So I'm no more interested in those affairs. When you come here, then I will go to Calcutta. If I see that they are interested about devotional service, then only will I maintain my establishment there. Otherwise, I will not maintain them anymore. Bring a quilt for me. Yours, Abhay. The 2 interests, family and preaching, were conflicting. Radharani had never shown any interest in Back to Godhead. She seemed to work against his enthusiasm, both for publishing and for earning. The business was called Abhay Charan De and Sons, and yet the sons were disinclined to help. And when he had called for his servant to join him in Lucknow, the family had objected, saying they needed Gauranga more there. What was the use? The family was interested neither in backing him in his business nor in taking up the life of devotional service. And since his business was primarily an outcome of his family life, he resented that he had to give it so much of his energy. It was the old economic law by Marshall that he had learned in college. Without family affection, a man's economic impetus is weakened. Of course, there could be a compatible balance between family service and devotional service. Bhaktivinoda Thakur had described two simultaneous obligations, bodily and spiritual. Social status, mental development, cleanliness, nourishment, and the struggle for existence were all bodily obligations. The activity of devotional service to Krishna was spiritual, and the two should parallel one another. In Bhaktivinoda Thakur's life, his family was a source of spiritual encouragement, and he used his social position to advance his preaching. But Abhay's experience had been different. The two paths seemed to be at war, each threatening the other's existence. He felt himself operating somewhat like the materialists he had criticized in his writings, absorbed in the struggle for existence, with insufficient time for self-realization. Absorbed in the struggle for existence. Although his family made more and more demands of him, he was feeling less inclined to work for them and more inclined to preach Krishna consciousness. It was a predicament. He could only push on diligently, support his family, expand his business, and hope for a great success so that he could revive his publishing. But the Lucknow factory seemed almost beyond his means. He had purposely begun on a large scale with the aim of making a larger profit. But monthly expenses were high. He had fallen behind in his rent, and now he was involved in a court case with the landlord. Although he was visiting Calcutta regularly and shipping raw materials from Calcutta to Lucknow daily, he always found his family members in Calcutta uncooperative. His servant Gauranga was also reluctant to work as Abhay required and was thinking of going back to live with his family. Abhay again wrote to Gauranga on the 23rd, offering my humble obeisances at the feet of the Vaishnava. Gauranga Prabhu, I have received your postcard dated 18th November 1945 and got all the information. There is no need to come here just for a month after spending the money, and then go back. For the present, take 25 rupees from Dubra and go home. Write a letter to him after your arrival. Then I will send the rest of your money in 1 or 2 installments by money order. Then from there you let me know when you can come here. I have started my work here in a fairly big scale. You have seen that with your own eyes. So if there is no income, who will spend for a court interrogation? Everything is on my head. The brother and sons are just eating and sleeping like a bunch of females and breaking the axe on my head. You go home as soon as you get the money and try to come back as soon as possible. Yours, Shri Abhay Charan Dev. So Prabhupada was also caught between material, family.
Is it Mataji?
At least for some time it seemed like he was somewhat struggling, but he seemed to have already come to terms with that the family was a lost case, basically. And he was
It's very helpful reading Līlāmṛta.
Yeah, his back to Godhead with sarcasm. That's really funny. Bernard Shaw's wishful desire. Mr. Churchill's humane world. Yes.
Okay, we are at 6:40. Shall we start the next chapter or come back tomorrow? What is all of your pick?
Let's read, Prabhu,
Okay.
because still like 20 minutes left, right?
Yeah, let's read. Unknown. We have Sundari Līlāmṛta also. Mata, you want to? You're in a position to read. You want to?
Yes, Prabhuji.
Okay, the 6th chapter.
Yeah, sure, Prabhuji. An unknown friend. Let the sharp moralists accuse me of being illusioned. I don't mind. Experts in the Vedic activities may slander me as being misled. Friends and relatives may call me frustrated. My brothers may call me a fool. The wealthy mammonists may point me out as mad. And the learned philosophers may assert that I'm sorry, Prabhuji. Okay. I said that I'm too much proud. Still, my mind does not budge an inch from the determination to serve the lotus feet of Govinda, though I am unable to do it. Madhavendra Puri. Aside from his difficulties with business and family, Abhay had to survive the cataclysm of Indian independence and partition. He was not active politically, but was one of hundreds of millions affected by the violent dawn of Indian independence. While Gandhi and the Hindu-dominated Congress were demanding a united free India, the Muslim League, led by M.A. Jinnah, called for partition and their own Muslim nation, Pakistan. The conflict raged. In August 1946, the outgoing British government invited Jawaharlal Nehru, Congress Party president, to form an interim national government, but the League objected. The Muslim cause would be denied. Jinnah had already declared August 16th Direct Action Day, which amounted to little in most parts of India, but in Calcutta erupted in Hindu-Muslim rioting. In 5 days of violence, 4,000 died and thousands more wounded. In the months that followed, Hindu-Muslim rioting repeatedly flared up throughout India. Early in 1947, when the new Viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, met with Indian political leaders to plan transfer of power, riots again broke out as Muslims demanded Pakistan. At the threat of civil war, Congress finally agreed on partition, and on July 18th, the Indian Independence Bill passed without dissent. 1 month later, India and Pakistan emerged as independent nations with Jawaharlal Nehru as India's first Prime Minister. Partition tore India, leaving 5 million Sikhs and Hindus in Pakistan and as many Muslims in India, and the Great Migration began. Refugees fleeing from Pakistan to India and from India to Pakistan clashed with each other and even with their own countrymen of the opposing faith, and the violence that erupted claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Srila Prabhupada. Our independence movement was started by Mahatma Gandhi for uniting all the different sections of the people. But actually the result was that instead of being united, the India was partitioned. And the partition became so poisonous that formerly there was only sporadic Hindu-Muslim riots some places, but now there was an organized fighting between Pakistan and Hindustan. So actually, we were not being united, we are being separated. The Hindus would go to the mosque of the Muslim and break it, and the Muslim would go to the temples of Hindus and break the idol. And they will think we have finished the Hindus' God. Just like the Hindus also think, oh, we have broken their God. They're all ignorant. God cannot be Hindu, God cannot be Muslim, God cannot be Christian, God is God. We have seen in 1947 Hindu-Muslim fighting. One party was Hindu and the other party was Muslim. They fought and so many died. And after death, there was no distinction who was a Hindu or who was a Muslim. But the municipal men gathered them together in piles to throw them somewhere. They fought, and in Bagh Bazaar, there were heaps of dead bodies. And when it is a dead body, nobody could understand who was Hindu and who was Muslim. Simply it was to be cleared from the road. Abhay was not expecting Indian independence to bring any real solutions, unless the leaders were God conscious. What change would there be? Now he saw that instead of suffering at the hand of the foreign rule, the people were free to suffer under their own countrymen. In fact, the fighting and suffering had increased. Throughout the years of India's political struggles, Abhay had never lost his desire to propagate Krishna consciousness. He had seen how promises of unity and independence had brought mostly higher prices and civic mismanagement. He had seen neighborhoods where Indians had lived peacefully for generations erupt in hatred and rioting. In the wake of British and Indian diplomatic manipulations, it was as Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had described it. Persons who strongly entrusted by the consciousness of enjoying material life and who have therefore accepted as their leader or guru a similar blind man attached to the external sense objects cannot understand that the goal of life is to return home back to Godhead and engage in the service of Lord Vishnu. As blind men guided by another blind man miss the right path and fall into a ditch, materially attached men led by another materially attached man are bound by the ropes of fruitive labor, which are made of very strong cords, and they continue again and again in materialistic life, suffering in the threefold miseries. The Vaishnava prays to his spiritual master, who has opened my eyes with the torchlight of transcendental knowledge, and feels obliged to help humanity by bearing the same torch. As a representative of the eternal Vaishnava Parampara, Abhay wanted to shed the light of transcendental knowledge onto the field of current crisis that had been the purpose of Back to Godhead. Although since 1944 he had been unable to print the magazine, but even without the means to publish, Abhay continued writing. His most ambitious project was Gita-Upanishad, his translation and commentary of Bhagavad-Gita. Gandhi and others often spoke of the wisdom of Bhagavad-Gita. Indians never forgot their Gita, but most proponents did not teach it as Krishna had taught it. They would not recognize Lord Krishna, the speaker of their Gita, as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, but would extract his words as slogans to bolster their own philosophies. Whether political leaders, religious leaders, or scholars, they almost invariably made their own symbolic and allegorical interpretations. Abhay wanted to present Bhagavad Gita as is. It was to be 1200 pages, 3 illustrated, beautifully bound volumes. For Abhay, the books were already a reality from which he was separated only by time. Over the past 2 years, he had accumulated hundreds of manuscript pages. He wrote in notebooks and on loose papers and then typed the numbered manuscript pages. He could never give the book his full time. He could never give the book his full time, but gradually it began to take shape. He also preached Lord Chaitanya's message through letters, writing to many leaders in the government, to respectful acquaintances, and to people whose articles he had read or whose activities had caught his eye in the newspaper. Presenting himself as the humble servant, he wrote to them of his ideas on how India's original Krishna conscious culture could be applied as a successful solution to all manners of dilemmas. Sometimes his letters drew replies, and the Abhay would respond, fanning the sparks of interest wherever he found them. A well-known reformer, Mahendra Pratap Raja, was forming what he called the World Federation. Abhay had read a news sheet which Mr. Pratap had published from Vrindavana, in which he addressed all nations and peoples of the world and called for a unity of mankind. Abhay wrote to him suggesting that the Lord Krishna's teachings in Bhagavad-Gita provided a theistic science capable of uniting all religions. Mr. Pratap replied in May 1947, "Admire your deep study of Srimad Bhagavad-Gita. I myself am a great admirer of the great classic. I assure you that I am working strictly according to the book." Mr. Pratap mentioned his book, Religion of Love, and suggested that Abhay read it if he wanted to know the World Federation's view of religion. In the meanwhile, Mr. Pratap wrote, "I don't agree to your suggestion of making the name of Krishna or Govinda as the basis of unity of religions. This would amount to conversation and won't lead to unity of religions. I highly appreciate your efforts in the direction of back to Godhead." Abhay got the book, read it, and in July 1947, while he was visiting Kanpur, wrote a reply. He had traveled to Kanpur not as a spiritual teacher but as a pharmaceutical salesman. Yet a typewriter had been available, and out had come his preaching. In continuation of my last postcard, I beg to inform you that I have finished the reading of your book, Religion of Love. In my opinion, the whole thesis is based on the philosophy of pantheism, and the approach is made by the services of mankind. Religion of love is the true religious idea, but if the approach is made through the service of the mankind only, then the process is made imperfect, partial, and unscientific. The true religion of love is perfectly inculcated in the Bhagavad-Gita. Besides, you have not quoted any authority for all of your statements, so it is more or less dogmatic. If different men put different dogmatic views about the religion and its essentials, who is to be accepted and who is not to be? Therefore, the approach shall be and must be authoritative, scientific, and universal. Abhay then gave a summary of the Bhagavad Gita in 10 points, concluding, "The highest service that can be rendered to mankind is, therefore, to preach the philosophy and religion of Bhagavad Gita for all time, all places, and all people." But
Mataji, was it here?
yes, Prabhuji.
Yeah. Want to share some of your experiences from the reading?
Yes, Prabhuji. I got to know that we are reading again through Priyanka Mataji. So it would be really good if you put the Zoom in any other WhatsApp messages, Prabhuji. So everybody can join this wonderful Srila Prabhupada Līlāmṛta. So until what I read, Prabhuji, it was so good. Srila Prabhupada, how much struggle he went through during that independence time. And Pratap, oh my God, he really he put his views in Bhagavad-Gita and the religion of love. He did write it in the way his own misrepresentation of Bhagavad-Gita. I really, I feel really good. I could say that my life is all about Prabhupada. In the morning, we'll have Bhagavatam. We read Srila Prabhupada commentary. We are not at all misguided or mislead our path. We know Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And everywhere, wherever we see Prabhupada commentaries, wherever we see that Krishna is Supreme Personality of Godhead. And God, I could say God is God. God is not a Muslim or God is not a Hindu. That one I really liked it. So these are like touching points. And I want to read more, Prabhuji. Thank you for starting again, and reading with all others is fun.
Thank you, Mataji, for joining.
Thank
Were
you.
you in book distribution group, Mataji?
Book distribution. Yes, Prabhuji.
I sent a message there.
Oh,
Maybe I can ask you this help.
sure.
Maybe you can repost and you can ask, because if I do it more than 2-3 times, then it will not be nice. We don't want, we do. I posted like 2-3 times, and then if it will
Oh,
not be nice. Right,
oh,
Chintamati, what do you say? I usually ask a suggestion mostly.
yeah, I can post tomorrow, Prabhuji, around 4:30, and to ask them to join maybe.
Yeah.
In which group, Prabhuji?
It's book distribution group.
Book distribution. Oh, I am not in there.
You're not in there, so we cannot do anything, right, Mati? That also I post usually in another application. When we post, if you want to join the group, I send the link. So, but it's everyone.
I think Priyanka Mataji, had you posted on the Vaishnavi group as well?
Yes, Mataji, yesterday.
Yeah. Yeah. So whoever is missing, they had to miss. Sorry. Right?
Just check once. Check once, Sundari
Yeah.
Mataji.
Yeah,
I'll check.
I'll check with anybody if they want to join. I'll call them because there's so many interested and they don't never know that it started again. Yeah, sure. I'll update all other devotees. Thank you, Prabhu.
Okay, thank you, Mataji. And I'm feeling very gladdened and supported by Srila Prabhupada. Really, he is also demonstrating, as Chintamani Mataji pointed, the struggle between business, family, and spiritual life. Yet he was like, his vision is like very, it's very, what do we say? Not just surprising, it's amazing. He was just shooting to the big politicians and big government officials, and I don't know. And I was also appreciating, when maybe Krishna is preparing Prabhupada, I don't know, I can say it, but such grasp in the current affairs and the spiritual affairs and translated the books. We are fortunate.
Yeah. Plus he kept up his business, and so many times he stopped and started and everything.
he got the dream and he's not going. It is me, then he go. Okay, I'm given authority now. I will rule the kingdom. Yeah, so nice. It really encouraging the practice of devotional service to persist and keep moving in Krishna consciousness.
Yes, Prabhu. I guess that shows it's not too late, so should not be disheartened. Prabhupada, you just continue on, and I mean,
Yeah.
Prabhupada was destined to go abroad at the age of 70. I mean, that's what his astrologer had also said, right, when he was a young boy. And yeah, but regardless of that, he continued on because of his Guru Maharaj's instruction.
Yeah. And anyone else? Okay, we will continue tomorrow with this chapter, Unknown Friend, and then possibly move into the next chapter as well, which will be Prabhupada starting his Jansi, the League of Devotees, chapter 7. Okay, we are moving fast. That's good. Okay. Hare Krishna. Thank you all for your presence.
Thank you,
Hare
Prabhu.
Krishna. Thank you, Prabhuji. Thank you, all devotees.
Thank
Hare
you.
Krishna.
Līlāmṛta, please, encourage and please help with promoting the glories of Prabhupada, or whatever way you were thinking. Okay, Mataji.
Sure, Prabhu. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Very well.